Hi, I'm Skip Nipper. Welcome to my podcast, where I tell you about not only Nashville's great baseball history and traditions,
shot to right, a one-hop liner,
but certainly about its past. And you will hear a little bit about its present and future, too.
Yes, he can. It makes the waist-high catch.
There are great stories about Tom Wilson Park, Herschel Greer Stadium, Sulphur Dell, and the players, coaches, and fans who love everything about baseball. And every once in a while, you will get to hear from a special guest who will share their fondness and even passion for the great game.
The high fly ball down the right field corner, going way back, hits a lead-off home run.
I'm going to introduce to you someone that I've known for some time, probably not in the circles that you may expect. And we're going to go a little off topic here in the beginning, but I'm going to introduce you to Trapper Haskins. And his bio on his book, which I just loved his book, says, a deckhand and a dishwasher, a shipwright and house carpenter, a street musician and cubicle dweller, Trapper Haskins has earned his keep in myriad ways since leaving school in his hometown of Memphis more than 20 years ago. Today, he and his family live in Thompson Station, Tennessee, where he works as a furniture maker, finished carpenter, and freelance writer. His writing has appeared in Sports Illustrated, Wooden Boat, and American Songwriter. I enjoyed his book. It's called Crooked Old River, and I want you to see, I want you to hear now, Trapper Haskins. Trap, thanks for joining me on this episode.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Baseball history. As you said, you heard baseball history. There's nothing in there about boating, but it's going to take us in a circle here that I think we could. So, Crooked Old River. Now, I wrote this to you. This is not a tale like Huckleberry Finn, but more of an account, a complete journey of an adventure. It's permeated with those thoughts of Huckleberry Finn. This is me, because as I'm reading, I'm thinking parallel to Huckleberry Finn. But
right,
talk about that. Tell me about how you got started in this, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm a Memphis kid, born and raised in Memphis, and there is a park downtown called Mud Island, where my mother used to take me and my sister when we were kids. And at this park, it's a 52-acre park on a peninsula that sticks out into the Mississippi River. And there is a scale model of the Mississippi River where I think every step, so every 3 feet is about a mile of the lower Mississippi. And my sister and I, we used to go there during the summer growing up in Memphis, and we would get popsicles at the popsicle stand there, and we'd eat our popsicle and throw the sticks into the little model river and sort of follow it down the curves to the Gulf of Mexico, which is it used to be a public pool. It's closed now, but we would, just chasing popsicle sticks down this model of the river is where I sort of first fell in love with the curves of it and just the shape and the history of it.
Okay. So then you had to have an idea to carry this through a life's journey, really.
Yeah.
And so you end up in Maine.
Yeah. So I've always sort of had a proclivity towards old timey things. And so loving the Mississippi and loving this river, when I was in college, I got a job on those tourist paddle wheel boats that take visitors to the city out on the Mississippi River. And I just sort of fell in love with being on the river, being on the water. And that led to me sort of falling in love with old timey sailboats. And if you're in Memphis and if you want to sail on those, the tall ships and stuff like that, you're going to go either to the East Coast or the West Coast. And I found a place in Maine that gave apprenticeships to people, basically. So my wife, we met at Memphis State, University of Memphis. And 2 weeks after the wedding, we moved up to Maine so I could learn the craft of building wooden boats. The idea being that I could then build my own. We could go anywhere in the world. Going from Memphis to Maine it's a change in culture, but it's also an enormous change in climate. And so that first winter, I remember looking through some books in the school's library, and they had one of the pages in one of them showed this boat called the Mississippi River Yawl. And a yawl boat is kind of it would be like a John boat today, just a utility boat that they used on the river. The steamboats used them as lifeboats. They used them to run people to shore, bring lines back and forth. And I don't know, there might have been a foot and a half, 2 feet of snow on the ground. And part of me was a little bit homesick for Memphis. And I left Memphis, in my early 20s thinking that I was glad to put it behind me and I didn't ever see myself returning. And then it wasn't until after I'd been gone for about a year and saw that boat and started thinking about the history of my hometown that I had this feeling like that I wanted to go back, not go back to live, but I just wanted to return there. And I thought, what a way to return than to take my newfound skill in building boats, build this yawl boat and row it down the Mississippi River. So that's exactly what we did when we were newlyweds. So Mandy and I had been married we'd been married 2 years when we started that trip. And it was supposed to take 90 days to go from the headwaters of the Mississippi in northern Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico. But a 90-day trip ended up taking 16 years to accomplish.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but you got to read the book to hear all the story.
Right.
We all have mentors, sometimes more than one. And along with Mandy, your wife, you encounter one who had a great impact on you, and his name was Dale Calhoun. And tell how he impacted your life.
Yeah, when I first sort of got this itch to build wooden boats, and sort of had it in my head that boat builders only existed on the coasts. Around that time, the Memphis Commercial Appeal ran an article on this boat builder named Dale Calhoun, who lived at Reelfoot Lake, so Tiptonville, Tennessee. He was one of the recipients of an award from the National Endowment of the Arts. And so they ran this article about this boat builder who had been building these fishing boats called stump jumpers. I believe his dad actually started the business. And, Reelfoot is a state park. And so Mandy and I, we were dating at the time. And I said, we got to go camping up at Reelfoot Lake. And she said, well, why do you want to go up to Reelfoot Lake? And I said, well, I want to see the lake, but I want to meet this boat builder. And so we went up there and we camped out one night. And then that next morning we went into his shop, and it was sort of, it was the first time I'd ever seen such a thing. It was sort of like, you see visual artists and they've got their easel and all these messy paints everywhere. And it just looks like a storm of creativity. And when I walked into his boat shop and could smell the cypress wood, it sort of had that same impact on me. It was just, he was a craftsman, even though at the time, I guess he would have been in his 60s. So he just looked like a nondescript grandfather, but it was evident that he was a craftsman and he was in love with building boats. And it sort of, it caught, Yeah.
And then along came Oxbow.
Yeah.
Oxbow is very special to you and Mandy.
Yeah. So Oxbow's that's the yawl boat that we built when we were in Maine. And anyone that's familiar with rivers and the way they move, if you look at a map, you can see oxbows, which are these sort of crescent or moon shaped lakes that sort of flank larger rivers or even smaller rivers, but it's where the channel has moved over time. The channel has shifted, and the old riverbed sort of becomes a stillwater lake. And so to me, those are like ghosts of the old river. And because we were building this yawl boat, which is sort of a ghost of the old river, they don't exist anymore, we decided to name that boat Oxbow. And just as a descriptor for the listeners, the boat's 18 feet long and about 4.5 feet wide. She sits maybe 12 or 14 inches out of the water, and she's painted dark green, which is not a very visible color to the towboats and ships on the Mississippi River, which made for some interesting encounters while we were rowing.
The whole time that you are on the river, you are so descriptive that you can almost feel yourself there. I honestly felt that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the words that you used in describing, and then you have your wife there with you, your companion, and all those things kind of add up into a great adventure. The things that you encounter along the way. And I'm chicken. I would never do that. And one of the things that you wrote, and this is a quote from your book, I think this is while you're in Maine, and a few rare people shared their own secretly harbored dream to do the same. Maybe it was veiled, that people want to do what you want to do, but they're afraid to say it because they don't want to end up being a loser, not complete the journey. What about people? How did people react to what you decided that you and Mandy wanted to do?
Well, so that quote that people in Maine people in Maine had ideas of doing similar things, but when we were on the river, there were several people on the river that said, "Well, I heard one of these days a lot. One of these days
Right.
when my daughter's gone to college, one of these days when I retire, I'm going to go down the river." You know, a lot of people that live near the river, they get enchanted by it the same way that I did, and they have this sort of dream to do it, but it's always one day, one day, one day. And at the time when I did this, when we started this trip the first time, I think I was 24 and Mandy was 23. So it was a time before mortgages, before kids. I don't think we had a car payment. She quit her job when I left my apprenticeship, and she quit her job to go do this. So we had sort of structured our lives in a way to have this freedom to go do this. But yeah, I think a lot of people, most people, have daydreams that are larger than their everyday life. And finding a way to make that happen, it can be a challenge. One, just because of the logistics of it, but two, people talk themselves out of doing things.
Yeah.
People, they over prepare sometimes, and that preparation becomes procrastination, and they end up not doing the thing. I've known people that had big plans to go on big trips, but they spend so much time trying to plan every detail that they just never end up starting. And my dad, he was always sort of a worrywart about things when I was growing up. And when we set out to do this river trip, he could not for the life of him understand why Mandy and I wanted to do this. And he actually told me when we were planning on doing it at one point, he said, there's a lot of curves in that river. And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I just want to see what's around the next curve and around the next curve. Like I'm not going to let it scare me off just because I don't know what's around the bend," if that makes sense.
Of course.
Yeah.
I told you about Huckleberry Finn, the thing that I thought about. The other thing I thought about, I think I asked you about this once before. I was working in Kentucky, and they opened this great new bookstore in Lexington called, I think it was Joseph Beth Bookstore. It was a beautiful bookstore. It was in this, you think of that strip center. Anyway, right off the interstate, right off of New Circle Road. And I went in there and I was fascinated with Kentucky because I was one of those guys that didn't stay on the interstate. I love to get over on the state routes and see deer and up and down the Ohio River wherever I could. And I ran across this man named Harlan Hubbard.
Shanty boat.
Yes. And he had a couple of others, but Shanty boat was a good one. It said that they lived near the river. I mean, they built their own home there on the Ohio River. And his wife had this great recipe for groundhog. I mean, they were living off the land.
I don't remember that part, but yeah.
And I thought, that's who you are to me. I mean, it brings it back into me. I just loved reading history, regional history, and area history when I was out of town. Well, that was in Ohio or Kentucky. Yeah. But I really enjoyed that series. So
I'm like you in that way, that driving on the interstate, traveling around, if I can, man, I love getting off the interstate and just driving the local roads. But Harlan Hubbard, when we finished our river trip, the first time when we stopped in New Orleans, we went back to Maine, and someone in Maine told me about Harlan Hubbard and that book, and I had never read it. So I ordered that book, and I mean, I ate that book up. I've got it right here on my shelf next to me. And that's sort of a secretly harbored dream of mine, is to, have a shanty boat one day.
Glaciers, dirt, sand, clay, sinkholes, and blind valleys. And here's the quote: "From our boat, the land had an excruciating beauty, the kind you cannot look away from, but also can't quite bear to stare at for long." What'd you mean by that? You remember?
Yeah. There are places and scenes that are just, I guess what I meant by excruciating is it's overwhelming. I remember the first time my granddad took me to, and this is going to bring it back to baseball. The first time my granddad took me to a Major League Baseball game was at Wrigley Field.
Yeah.
And I was in kindergarten. And I remember when we walked out, seeing that impossibly big expanse of green.
Yeah.
And it just had this overwhelming, onslaught's not the word, but it's just overwhelming. And you can't, you don't want to look away from it. But the longer you look at it, the more it's sort of, it's almost too much.
Yeah.
I guess, if that makes sense. And some people get that sort of feeling when they're looking at mountains. I personally get that feeling when I'm around or looking at wetlands and rivers and sort of the lower swampy areas and stuff like that. It's a beauty that part of me just wants to continually stare at it, and the other part of me is just overwhelmed by the beauty of it.
That's what another thing I love about your book. Once again, part of that descriptive voice that you have, I think, to the reader. 3 months, 2,200 miles,
Yeah.
beginning where?
So the headwaters of the Mississippi River are at Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota, which is 500 river miles north of Minneapolis. Fully a quarter of the river is above Minneapolis, which was crazy for me to learn. Somebody from Memphis, I'd only seen the river as this big behemoth, and then you get up to Minnesota in the North Woods there, and the Mississippi is only, it might be 15 feet wide and it's ankle deep. And so for Mandy and I to stand there and look at this sort of this infant of a Mississippi was just staggering to me, that was the same river that rolled through my hometown. But yeah, that's where we started. And we actually started in a canoe because after I built the yawl boat, I realized looking at maps that, when rivers start, they're really small. And so our boat was too big to take all the way to the headwaters. So we left Oxbow in St. Paul, Minnesota, 500 miles downriver from the headwaters. And so we borrowed a canoe to do the first 500 miles before we switched into the rowboat to do it. But yeah, it's a pretty nice scene up there.
Again, the things that you talk about, and I don't want to go through the whole book because you got to leave something to the reader. We don't have time. Number one, you don't. But along the way, you seem to discover a lot of things that people don't stop and realize that are on the river. Lost boundaries, states, regions, North and South, and even the Union and the Confederacy, that you call out some things there that you discovered. How exciting was that to be able to put that into this trip where you were able to uncover things like that?
Yeah, to me, being like you, sort of a fan of regional history, like I loved it. It was so exciting to learn. We look at a map of the U.S. and you see the Mississippi River and you think, oh, well, the Mississippi River, that's the boundary between the state of Mississippi and the state of Arkansas and all these other states going up and down the valley. But you look closer at it and you realize there are parts of Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, that are on the west side of the river, and there are parts of Arkansas that are on the east side of the river. Because when they drew those state boundaries, the river has shifted since then. The river has created these oxbows. The river, the old channel has moved, but the state boundaries stay where they are. And so you have these little islands of neighboring states that are across the river. And the other thing that, when we passed from Tennessee into Mississippi, we learned that at Norfolk Landing, which is the first little tiny town, I don't think there's not even a town there these days, but Norfolk Landing, Mississippi used to have a customs house because Mississippi, voted itself out of the Union, and Tennessee was not yet a Confederate state. And so the line between Mississippi and Tennessee was an international boundary. Those sort of things for me as a fan of regional history was exciting for me to uncover, even though they're probably common knowledge for historians. But it was, those sort of things always get me.
Oh, yeah. And then you were asked, now this is going back to the end, towards the end, because there's a second part to the story too.
Right.
But you were asked several times, what'd you get out of it? What'd you get out of it? Adventure, a sense of accomplishment? What'd you get out of that trip? You and Mandy together.
That's something that even all these years later, I can't put it into words. It's a, what I can say this, what I got out of it, I know inside of myself, even though I have a hard time putting it into words, but it was empowering. It was an empowering feeling to dreamed of doing something, to put your hands to work making something, and then to do that thing you set out to do. But if you had asked me when I started, are you doing this to gain some sense of empowerment? Of course, that's not what I would have said. It would have been adventure. I want to see parts of the country that nobody ever sees. We want to live off the grid and sort of live wild for a little while. And it was, it was all of those things. I got a real sense of who I was, and I got a real sense of how, strong Mandy and I's marriage is and has become. When we were in Maine, one of the old timers used to come in the boat shop, and I was telling him about my trip. And he said, well, if one of you hasn't drowned the other by the time you reach the end, I'd say you'll be married for life.
There you go. There you go. It's close quarters
Yeah, it's very
for,
18,
on a boat. Yeah.
18 feet and a little pup tent. Those are close
Yeah.
quarters to live in for 3
Yeah.
months. Yeah.
We'll kind of touch on the end of the first trip, and then
Okay.
the time that it took for you to get ready to go to the second trip to
Yeah.
actually complete that journey. Where did you end, and what time did you end after how many months? And then where did you pick it up again after you had to refurbish Oxbow? Is that
We
right?
did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how long was that?
Well, so we ended that first trip. Again, the intention when we set out on that first trip, the intention was to do the whole river from the headwaters all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And a couple of things just to where we made a decision to stop in New Orleans. Many people see it as a coastal city, but the reality is New Orleans is 100 river miles from the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
And we had met a ship's captain about 2 days north of New Orleans, and he was trying to talk us out of going further because once you reach Baton Rouge, that's where all the oil refineries and the petrochemical companies are. And so the traffic on the river at that point is not just the barges that we see out here on the Cumberland River or on the Mississippi River. You're talking about ocean going tankers,
Yeah.
1,000-foot long ships, and an 18-foot boat painted dark green, squatted low on the water is a pretty, it's an invisible thing to those ships. And so the ship's captain was telling us, in no uncertain terms, you guys are, you're taking your life into your hands doing this. This is beyond crazy. You guys need to pull the boat out of the water. Mandy at the same time wasn't feeling well. She was having some stomach issues that we couldn't really resolve. And so we pulled the boat out of the water in Lake Pontchartrain. There is a canal called the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal that connects the Mississippi River just downriver of the French Quarter. It connects the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain. And so we went up that canal, pulled the boat out, and my uncle came down from Tennessee to get us. And at the time, I thought, well, I've done everything I set out to do. I don't have anything to prove to myself or anybody else. This journey has seen its end is really how I felt about it at the time. And it took years to discover that in my gut, it really wasn't finished.
And you go into your personal life. You open yourself up too in your
Yeah.
book about the things that you were up against, you and Mandy together, and you were starting
Yeah.
a family. You have how many
Yep.
children? Two children?
We have two children. They're now both in high school, but at the time we had a farm about halfway between Nashville and Chattanooga. We had a farm. I had started my cabinet making, woodworking business down there, and things were going okay until the economy sort of took that nosedive that it did around 2010. And for guys like me, guys that work in the trades, it was a pretty devastating blow. And so financially, we were sort of underwater. We ended up moving up to the Nashville area, moved in with my parents, actually. So we were a family of four, two kids just out of diapers, and we were living in one room in my parents' house to sort of try and get back on our feet. And Mandy went back to school. I went back to school and I ended up doing something that as a teenager, I said I would never do. And that was work in an office.
Right.
And so, I was wearing wingtip shoes and a collared shirt, and I was sitting at a computer 8 hours a day. And I just, the good Lord didn't build me to do that, so
Yeah.
I did that for a few years. And, I worked at a large architecture firm, and we did mostly commercial buildings. So it would have been schools and hospitals and stuff like that. And the way that I put it these days is I drew hospital rooms until I ended up in one.
And one, right.
Yeah. Sort of had had a bit of a nervous breakdown. I had just turned 40 years old. And so I was taking stock of my life and realized that I had somehow brought myself to a place that I didn't think of that I would be, which is just, being an office guy, just working for the weekend, not only not enjoying what I was doing during the workday, but the weekends always went too fast. And I just felt like the way I was living was not in line with the sort of creative pursuits that I had always been so invested in.
Right.
And at that time, so again, I'm 40 years old, and I wanted to reconnect or revive who I used to be. And I told Mandy, I think it's time we go back and finish the river. But It's an easy thing to say. It's a harder thing to do because the boat, Oxbow, that we went down the river in, we had held onto that boat just because I couldn't bear to let it go. So we didn't put her in the water. We never took it out on any of the lakes around Nashville, but I just couldn't bear to let her go. So the boat sat out in the backyard and basically just rotted for more than a decade. So we brought the boat into the carport and realized just how extensive the rot was. And my kids at the time, they would have been, I want to say 9 and 11. So I sort of shanghaied them to come out to the carport and be my apprentices. So I was an apprentice at one time. They became my apprentices. And the three of us, Piper, Wyatt, and me, rebuilt Oxbow while, Mandy took care of some other things. Yeah. And then, we took the boat back down to Lake Pontchartrain, exactly where Mandy and I had taken it out 16 years earlier. And the four of us put the boat in the water to go finish the final 100 miles, hopefully as a family, and reach the Gulf. So that was part 2 of the trip, and that took place in 2018. So the original trip was 2002, and then 16 years later in 2018, we decided to give it a second go, and it was not without its own excitement and I would say run-ins, but that might not be the right word, but meetings on the water. Sure. Encounters with both the U.S. Coast Guard and the Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office on the river.
Right. Right. Along with sundry and sultry other characters up
yes, absolutely.
Which is it's really great.